Hi everybody, this is Katje. Tonight I would like to welcome you to my YouTube channel once more. And this evening I would like to return to some philosophical and theological issues that I have touched upon briefly, but I would like to go into somewhat more detail this evening, not too long, but just a little bit more. So the material that I want to discuss this evening has to do with the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the way that I have been using some of his philosophical ideas to develop a particular theological position that I currently find very attractive. And part of developing that position involves criticizing, using Nietzsche's ideas, at least, to criticize and deconstruct, if you will, some previous theological positions that I have taken seriously, and especially in connection with the writings of Martin Heidegger. So I don't want to review any of that tonight. What I want to do instead is talk a little bit about Nietzsche's own positive views to the extent that I can discern what they are. And I want to say something about what I take to be problematic about those philosophical views of Nietzsche's. And finally, I want to conclude by discussing the relevance of that for the theological and philosophical project that I've been talking about over the last few weeks or so. So let's just go to Nietzsche's positive view and talk about that a little bit and see exactly what is it that Nietzsche himself sets forth as his kind of worldview, as his kind of philosophical position. Now, if you'll recall, it's very important to the role I assign Nietzsche's thinking in my own project that he doesn't really, insofar as he's engaged in some kind of criticism, it's not so much that he's presenting a theory, it's that he's presenting alternative possibilities that we need to take seriously. So it's a kind of what-if skepticism. And if we can't rule out these alternative explanations of Gelassenheit, let's say, this experience of energized tranquility, or of the kind of experience of struggle that the strife theologian talks about, Nietzsche gives very non-theological alternative explanations of those phenomena that I've discussed in considerable detail before. And so if we can't rule out these explanations, at least that are available to us from Nietzsche's writings, then that would undermine those positions. So that's the kind of what-if skeptical critique that I take to grow out of Nietzsche's philosophy and that can be used against those previous theologies I mentioned. Now, that doesn't say anything, though, about Nietzsche's positive view, so let's go back and talk about that a little bit. Let's remind ourselves about some aspects of this view that we've discussed before. So one thing that's very important to Nietzsche is one needs to have this sort of positive life instinct. And it's a very positive, pro-attitude towards life and living. It's a kind of vigor. It's a kind of, almost a kind of virility, if you will. But it's a kind of really positive, affirmative life instinct from which various beneficial effects flow. So that would be things like health, that would be things like intelligence, shrewdness, powerful success, any kind of success, freedom from weakness, strength. All of those things flow from the fundamental life instinct that Nietzsche takes to be very, very important. And when something does not exhibit these various beneficial effects, that's a very good sign, according to Nietzsche, that it doesn't really participate in the life instinct, or that its life instinct has become degenerate, entartet in German. There's an Entartung, a degeneration there, a degeneracy, and so that would be something that Nietzsche does not want to have anything to do with. Now, one of the problems that we saw with this in an earlier video is that each one of us at some point in our lives manifests some kind of weakness, whether it be an illness, or a failure in some enterprise, or a weakness, or an error. We all do that quite frequently, as a matter of fact. Now, Nietzsche associates this positive life instinct and with indulging in it and cultivating it with the Ubermensch. That's the super person, the Superman in German. And so to the extent that we all exhibit at some point in our lives weakness or illness or one of these other negative manifestations or behavioral manifestations, that would be an indication that we do not have this fundamentally positive life instinct, and so that we aren't Ubermensch, and that we don't really succeed in that. And the danger is that on Nietzsche's positive view of the Ubermensch, to the extent that we can discern what that is and how it's tied to this life instinct, nobody succeeds in being an Ubermensch, and it's very unlikely that anybody ever would, because there's always going to be sickness, there's always going to be weakness, there's always going to be failure in some form. So that would make it very impossible, would make the Ubermensch kind of an empty category that really isn't of any use or any application. Now, I think Nietzsche has an answer to this available to him that I've discussed a little bit before, and that has to do with this idea of the ewige Wiederholung, the eternal return. And this, it seems to me, grows out of Nietzsche's early fascination with ancient Greek tragedy. So in The Birth of Tragedy, die Geburt der Tragödie, in this work, Nietzsche is very interested in how Greek tragedy arose, and he gives a very original explanation of that. He thinks that this was a way in which the ancient Greek people dealt with suffering and problems in life, so that they would stage these performances that were repeatable. And in these performances, there are all kinds of awful things that happen. You can think of the Oedipus story with the saints, and then what happens to Oedipus eventually when he's, murdered by his own son and so forth. So, you can think about all of the tragedy, the terrible things that happen in ancient Greek tragedies, but for Nietzsche, this is deliberate, because this is the way that the ancient Greeks dealt with weakness or suffering. They kind of aestheticized it or turned it into drama. And by repeating it, this was their way of accepting suffering. Those dramas, those tragedies, the Tragödien, they can be performed, indefinitely many times, and each time we participate in them, whether we're performing in them or we're spectators, we're in the audience, we are participating in it, and we are sort of dealing with suffering and confronting it head on and sort of overcoming it in a way. So this is Nietzsche's view about tragedy in very basic terms. Now it seems to me in Nietzsche's later thinking, this transforms into this idea of an eternal return. And the basic idea is that the Ubermensch is the person who is willing, and in fact does, has lived the same life infinitely many times in the past, and will be living it over and over again infinitely many times in the future. Whatever happens in life, no matter how great it is, how good it is for me, how positive or how negative, how sick I might get or weak, or how many triumphs I have, whatever, it's going to be a checkered situation. If I'm willing, and if I have in fact lived it infinitely many times in the past, and will live it infinitely many times in the future, then the fact that I have weakness, or the fact that I have some kind of negativity or sickness or whatever is irrelevant, because I am participating in this eternal recurrence, and that's an indication that I'm an Ubermensch. And remember, it's very important in the realm of ideas that we're dealing in right now, that we're engaging, that we avoid any kind of doubt, any kind of skepticism. If Nietzsche's philosophy, which is a kind of anti-theology as I understand it, if his positive theology engenders or gives rise to doubt about whether I'm a Superman, an Ubermensch, or whether anybody is, then it's in trouble. That would be a serious problem for it, and it seems to me that the eternal recurrence is supposed to overcome that doubt by saying, well, look, the Ubermensch is the one who, despite suffering and experiencing tragedy in his or her life, that is the person who has lived that life infinitely many times in the past, will live it infinitely many times in the future, and this cosmological fact about me is what makes me an Ubermensch. So that seems to me to be very, very important to Nietzsche's positive view. Now, there's a question, though, that arises about this, and I think we can understand it by asking ourselves, well, wait a minute, why is it in the situation of eternal return that Nietzsche has described, and I'm going to put return in quotation marks, why is that an eternal return of the same thing over and over and over again, as opposed to an eternal repetition of things that are exactly identical, but that are really different? In other words, maybe what's going on here is not that I have literally lived the same life over and over again infinitely many times in the past, and will live it over and over again infinitely many times in the future. Why isn't it alternatively the case? How do we know? What if it is alternatively the case that what really happened is that there's just a bunch of duplicates. There's me, and then there are infinitely many other people who are sort of like my twins or my doppelganger in German. They're exactly similar to me. They live exactly similar lives as I do, with all similar sufferings and similar triumphs over and over again. But I'm only in one of those cycles. All the other cycles are my twins. Doesn't have anything to do with me then. So I literally do not repeat my life infinitely many times. I'm simply one cycle of an infinitely many twins. Now, why isn't that the case, and how do we know that it isn't the case? If that is the case, then I'm not really an Ubermensch, or it's quite possible that I'm not, because I'm stuck with my weaknesses and my shortcomings, my illnesses, whatever they are, my tragedien, my tragedies in my cycle. They don't ever get repeated, and so there's no eternal overcoming of that. There's just me, and then all these other people who are exactly like me, but that they're exactly similar to me, but they aren't me. Now, what is Nietzsche's answer to this, or what could be an answer to this? And this is where I think Nietzsche moves into this notion of the so-called will to power. Now, to me, what's interesting about the will to power is that for Nietzsche, he takes this sort of out of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer thinks that the very heart of reality is a kind of abstract willing. That's it. And Schopenhauer thinks that we need to escape it. He has an almost Asian or Buddhist response to this. He thinks that's a bad thing, and that so the aim of human existence should be to get out of this will, this kind of abstract cosmological willing that Schopenhauer thinks is detrimental. Now Nietzsche takes that, but he inverts it, especially in his later writings. He turns that whole picture on its head and says, well, look, Schopenhauer is right, that there's this will that sort of is expressing itself at the heart of reality, but instead of turning away from it or trying to get out of it, we should embrace it. I should embrace it. And that, in fact, it seems to me, what Nietzsche needs in order to avoid this eternal duplication objection that I just floated, what he needs to say is something like the following. There's only one powerful will. There's only one will to power. That's the only genuine, particular, or individual in the universe. It's at the very heart of the universe. And what happens is that it eternally repeats itself. And each time it repeats itself, it's the same will. It's the same fundamental life instinct that different human beings participate in. But the point is that if I'm an Ubermensch, then I'm not the will to power. I'm simply its manifestation. And every time it manifests itself, it's sort of like when the sun rises infinitely many times. It's the same sun that rises, but it has, the same properties each time it rises. It's bright yellow on the eastern horizon. It's very warm. Let's say it's in the summer. It does that. So those properties are just, they're the same property, are repeated each time. Literally the same properties. But they're not individuals. They're simply characteristics that the sun itself manifests, and it's the only thing. And it recurs. It literally recurs with these characteristics, the same characteristic of being hot and yellow and so forth. And the same thing Nietzsche believes, I take him to believe, the same thing is true of me if I'm an Ubermensch. It's like the will to power repeats itself infinitely many times. And each time, this set of properties that we normally would identify with me pops up. But they're not different individuals, it's just these abstract properties that apply to the will that's repeating itself over and over again. And the will is the same. So that if I happen to be, or my life happens to be among these properties that characterize the will to power as it recurs over and over again in the way that yellowness and heat and intensity and roundness are properties that characterize the sun when it occurs over and over and over again, when it rises over and over again on the eastern horizon, then I'm an Ubermensch. That's what it is for me to be an Ubermensch. There's only one real individual, or individual power, and that's the will to power. Just like there's only one sun that rises on the eastern horizon that manifests the same properties over and over again, could do so conceivably infinitely many times. Now, where does that leave us? Well, where it leaves us is that Nietzsche, in order to avoid the skepticism with his positive view, he's going to need to do a lot more work than he really does in his philosophical writings. He never proves any of these things, at least as far as I can see, about the will to power and its relation to these properties, so that it's the same will that's going on, manifesting itself infinitely many times, and the properties simply get instantiated over and over again, but the will is the same. This kind of very heavy-duty metaphysical view that comes out of Schopenhauer and then is inverted in a certain way by Nietzsche, Nietzsche never really proves any of that. And so there's always this doubt, unless he can set forth some kind of metaphysical proof or argument, conclusive argument for that, we can never really be sure whether what we're dealing with is the eternal recurrence of the same or the eternal repetition of exactly identical particulars. Human beings that all look like me, but only one of them is me, and the rest of them are my exactly identical twins who aren't me. So unless Nietzsche is willing to set forth, unless he sets forth more positive metaphysical evidence to support this very, very controversial and powerful view, then it seems to me that he cannot overcome the skepticism that affects the heart of his positive view. Nevertheless, I don't think that we need to get into any of that in order to recognize the value of Nietzsche's skeptical critique, his purely skeptical critique that I have discussed before against both the Gelassenheit theology and Streit theology. I think that critique, that sort of what if, or could it be the case that there are these alternative explanations of the fundamental experience of Gelassenheit or the fundamental experience of struggle that don't have anything to do with divinity, that don't have anything to do with God. Can there be an alternative explanation of that? All Nietzsche has to do is to raise that skeptical possibility that the theologian cannot preclude in order for the critique to undermine those two theologies. And I don't think Nietzsche has to get into any of the other stuff about the will to power or the eternal return of the same or any kind of metaphysical proof of his positive position in order to levy this skeptical critique against the theologies, the Heidegger-inspired theologies that I just mentioned. So that's what I wanted to say. And I hope you see that, I really do think that this material is interesting and it bears very careful consideration. I've just begun writing a book about this that I hope to propose to a publisher in the not too distant future. But as you can tell, I'm quite excited about it. So I wanted to share some of my ideas with you. But until next time, this is Katje Eckhart, and I wish everybody, as always, a safe and restful and peaceful good night. And until next time, I will be thinking of you, and I hope everybody is safe and secure. Bye-bye.